I just want to talk about why people have different opinions on video games and why that's okay. So, the main thing that people traditionally get really upset about and freak out about on the internet when it comes to me at the moment is when I give a sort of hot take on an older Nintendo franchise. For example, I don't love Ocarina of Time. I see the value in it. I see why so many people do it. I think it's great, and I super appreciate it for the time and respect everything it did for the gaming industry. But going back and playing that game now isn't the same experience that you maybe got in the 90s, just because I am now akin to something that's a bit different. And I think my main issue with people screaming at me about having a different opinion is that it really starts to become an echo chamber. In the grand scope of video games and people talking about video games online, it's been relatively short. I mean, YouTube's recently a thing in the last, 20 or so years. And so because of that, it's now something that we can really start to share with people, our love of these older games. And if you love them, I think that's very valid. And I think you should be able to talk about that. But if I play the same game and, for example, I have a different opinion, maybe I don't love it as much as you do, I feel that I should also be able to share that opinion. And at the end of the day, neither one of our opinions hurt each other. All they're doing is allowing more voices to be heard. Now, I went through something when I was it's not something big, obviously, it's not like a traumatic shit, but when I was, first consuming a lot of Nintendo YouTube content, stuff like that, everybody would talk about how the best game of all time is Ocarina of Time. Watch Mojo's, top 10 best games of all time, number 1 is Ocarina of Time. So naturally, I assumed I needed to play it, and I assumed it was going to be one of the greatest experiences I've ever had. Not understanding at that time, of course, as a 13-year-old, that I'd actually grown up in the Wii generation, and I didn't have very much experience with these older, the first generation of really 3D games. And so because of that, I go and I buy Ocarina of Time on the virtual console, and I play it, and I get not super far, but far enough that I realized that I didn't like this game. I didn't like the way it played, I didn't like the way it looked, and all of those things obviously are products of their time. Obviously, Zelda has gotten better in the last few years. Obviously, it's not going to be the same. Obviously, it was crazy of me to expect 2020, at that time, it was probably 2016 level of video games from this game. Obviously, but as a kid, I didn't really understand that. And now looking back, obviously, that's not what I'm going in expecting. But I can go in expecting to have a decent time and expecting to be able to play the game despite some of the shortcomings it has. And I have gone into games and experienced them in that way. And honestly, I'm about at the water temple of Ocarina of Time, and I haven't played it for a second because I really don't think it's a game for me and I don't really like it very much. But there's a lot of value there, and I can see that. And I like the idea that it's this open sort of thing, and so I can see how cool that could be for people at that time. Now, the issue comes when I state my opinion on it that, hey, maybe it isn't my favorite game of all time, and hey, maybe if you went back and you played it, or maybe if you put yourself in my shoes and you were playing it for the first time, you wouldn't love it, because I can put myself in your shoes and understand that that's why you love it, and you have all these memories associated with it, and at that time it was groundbreaking, so of course you're going to love that new groundbreaking game. It makes a lot of sense, and that nostalgia and that childhood memory with it, that all makes a lot of sense. And even other people who have maybe played it more recently, or they're around my age but they still played the game as a kid or something, all of that makes a lot of sense to shape your gaming likes and dislikes. But again, that's not an issue. People having different opinions on a video game isn't an issue. The issue comes when we are not allowed to express those feelings, when people attack other people for simply stating how they feel on an art form. Video games are art. Art is subjective, okay? So you're gonna have a different opinion than I do. You're gonna like things that I maybe don't like, and that's just how the world is going to turn. It's how shit operates. We can agree on things, we can find common ground, but at the end of the day, it makes a lot of sense that maybe a game you grew up with, a game you love, isn't something that I grew up with, and therefore isn't a game that I necessarily love to go back to after not having any of that perspective, okay? Now, it is a similar situation here, as I really love a lot of Wii games, and there's a lot of gamers who don't love Wii games, and I love them because, in big part, that I grew up with them, and I that was the gaming that I knew when I was a kid. And so going back, it reminds me of my childhood a little bit. I have a really good time with it. But I can understand that for a lot of people, that type of control scheme isn't appealing. I can understand that something like Pikachu's Pokepark isn't a good game, but for me at the time, it was huge, and it was amazing because it was my first game I ever played. So I look back on it fondly, but I can understand why people don't like it. I can understand why people discount it. You know what I'm saying? And obviously, I'm not out here comparing Pikachu's Pokepark to Ocarina of Time. Obviously, that game changed the course of a lot of things, and Pikachu's Pokepark, for most people, didn't do anything. For me, it did a lot because it was the first game I ever beat by myself, which was huge. But that personal value that games have to you is going to be something that we all weigh. And so when we talk about video games objectively, there's not much we can talk about. We can talk about what's objectively in these games, but once we go into explaining how we feel about them, that's when the subjective comes in. Because games, more than a lot of different art forms, are really catered to your own experience with them, okay? So it's like, personally, I can't really get into JRPGs. I feel like they're too much of a time sink, and sometimes the boobs annoy me. I think it's a little crazy. That doesn't mean that you can't enjoy JRPGs. It means that that is a genre of games that isn't really for me. The complex battle mechanics, the systems that are involved there, it's not something that my brain automatically grabs onto and really likes. Contrarily, I really like platformers. I play a ton of them. I love platformers. It's kind of my favorite genre of game, and within there, there's a lot of games that I love, but there's also some games that I've played that I don't love so much, or there's some games that I've played that I really like, but they're so frustrating at points that they really frustrate me and make me annoyed. Again, these are all emotional responses I'm having to an experience that the video game is giving me. My emotional response is obviously going to be very different than your emotional response to this game. And so I make this whole entire video to explain to you why I view retro video games in the way that I do. I go back and I really try to play these games because people like you and also a lot of the other wider YouTuber space really love these games. They play them a lot. They're some of the best games of all time. So I want to experience those games naturally, as maybe I didn't grow up with them. I don't have that experience, so I go back and I play them. But the second my opinion differs, I get fucking shredded in the comments. It's just crazy. Now, obviously, YouTube comments on the internet are just not something that that anyone's ever gonna really be happy with or be able to control, just because they're so all over the place, right? I'm not saying everybody. A lot of people are very kind about having different opinions, and they're very understanding. But there is reasoning behind everything I say with my experience with a video game. I beat all of Super Metroid, and it wasn't for me. I prefer the more linear style of Metroid, but I understand that a lot of people prefer that more open-ended nature of it. They love the idea of getting lost in the Metroid world. That, for me, is a point of frustration, and so I prefer things like Fusion and Dread. And so it's just an interesting sort of push and pull, I feel, of people saying, you have to play this game, this is the game from my childhood, it's the best game of all time, experience it, and then I do that. But the second I have a little bit of a different opinion, it all goes to shit. This is not to say that there's some culture war against, old games and new games or whatever, because at the end of the day, it's video games, and none of this shit matters that much. It matters to you and me, but in the grand scope of the world, there's much bigger problems, right? So, I say all of this to say that people should always be allowed to give their opinions on how they feel about a video game. We should never be gatekeeping this holy ass opinion about a video game from the 80s or from the 90s or from the early 2000s. I love Mario Galaxy. People don't love Mario Galaxy. I love Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze. People don't love that game. I love Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. There's a lot of Zelda fans out there who don't love those games and want them to return to a more linear 2D style. I don't want that, but I can understand that perspective, and I respect those people still enough to not attack the fuck out of them on a personal level. And that's the thing. None of this stuff needs to be a personal attack to you. It's just opinions that people state. And these opinions are very, very harmless. They don't do anything. If I don't like Metroid, which isn't true, I do like Metroid, but for example, I don't like let's pretend that I don't like Metroid. I say I don't like Metroid, and you say, you, you're a bitch, and women shouldn't be on the internet. Now, whoa, let's unpack that, because that is a little bit more about you at a certain point and your internalized misogyny than about me having an opinion about Metroid, right? So maybe instead of having these crazy overt takes that cut to a personal level, we can understand that, hey, this style of game isn't for her. Or, hey, maybe that's just an outlier in a franchise that she really likes, and that game just isn't for her, but she likes these other ones that do coincide with it. There's all sorts of things that people should be allowed to share and should be allowed to have some sort of opinion on video games on, regardless of if they've beat them or not. Because sometimes you put down a game because it doesn't work for you. Sometimes I put down a game like Ocarina of Time because it's not something I want to devote my time to because I'm not having fun. And that doesn't take away from the fact that you had fun with the game. It just shows my perspective on it as someone, again, who didn't grow up with it. Someone who hasn't been exposed to this franchise since the very inception of it, which in your opinion that might suck for me, but in my opinion I don't know any different, so it doesn't really matter. I'm not saying this to start some sort of war in the comments either. All I'm saying is this is why I have some certain opinions about retro video games, and this is why I feel the way that I do. Like I've said many times in this video, I didn't grow up with these games, so I'm going back and I'm playing this with the bias of someone from 2024. And now you can never really objectively look at anything because you're always going to have biases. They say this all the time in like journalism school. You know, you are always going to have your biases that make you like a certain thing more than a different thing, right? And so because of that, hey, maybe I like current Switch games a little bit more than some of these older games that I'm looking at. But sometimes maybe there's an outlier and I like a certain game more than the others. And it doesn't mean I don't try different, genres of games and really try to open my eyes to the world of more video games. But again, at the end of the day, I just want to remind everyone that video games are supposed to be fun. It should be a fun hobby for you. It should be something that you really like to do and you look forward to, and something that doesn't cause you to go into angst and cause this whole sort of like culture war on new versus old gamers or male versus female gamers. It's crazy. It's crazy, and as a woman, it's a hard space to be in sometimes. I appreciate it. I love that I have a really passionate audience, but sometimes I think I should be able to share my opinion without a lot of people going to war per entry. If I don't like Metroid, the NES one, it doesn't take away from the fact that you like it, okay? I love that you like that game. I don't. Similarly, if you don't like Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze, it doesn't take away from the fact that I love it. We can have our own opinions, separate from each other, and that's all that needs to be said. I have a really banger video coming out at the end of this week, but I think I should just put this out there before that one comes out, okay? Goodbye.